So we're getting into the electronics installation of the XRAY X4, and it's getting close to the finish, but still we're gonna have to spend quite some time installing the electronics. So first of all, we're gonna put the servo on the car, and let's talk about the servo of choice here. We really recommend using a low profile servo for your X4 because it will give you the most weight savings and will give you the best amount of space on the chassis for the rest of the electronics. So a low profile servo is definitely preferred. And I'm gonna use the included reversible servo mount, which I've spoken about in the steering system video. So let's put this together here. I'm gonna use the initial setting for the servo mount, so the rearward position in this case. But as you know, it's indeed reversible. So when you install this servo here, you need to try to make it as centered as possible, because the servo mount has some space in it for using different types of servos to be able to fit all servos. So try to keep it centered in here. Try to make sure that it's not sitting too high or too low, and that it doesn't stick out on the inside part of the servo, because if it sticks out here, it might touch the belt, and that's something you want to avoid. And then we're gonna install the outer servo post here. Make sure that the servo is flat in this spot here. If not, you need to cut away any material there so that you can fit this post onto it. At first, we're gonna put the screw from the top, and then the two screws from the back here. And then again, as I said, it's important to make sure that the servo is centered in this whole assembly here. Okay, now I'm happy with how it looks. It's perfectly straight in this direction, and it's not sticking out on the inside, and it's ready to go onto the car. We need to remove the servo post here to fit the servo. Makes it easier to fit the servo, and then it fixates with two screws. And another screw, and it goes back onto the steering post here. And the servo horn, which I spoke about in the steering system setup video. you already know all about that. I'm just gonna put it in place here on this car. This link is a bit short. I'm just gonna make it a bit longer. Steering links look a little short. I'm just gonna adjust them as well. Okay, servo is in place, and we are ready to start with the rest of the electronics. Electronics installation is something that's become a little trickier since we went to a mid-motor platform with a T4, and it still stays that way for the X4 because the motor is still in the middle and the spur gear as well. So there's certain things you need to consider when you put the electronics in the car. And some of these issues can be hard to overcome, but I'm going to explain how to do this in the most simple way. So we have here the car empty, it just has the servo on it. We have here an electronics combo, which is the motor and the speedo already soldered together and ready to go into the car. So I've already done most of the work here. The most important thing here that you need to check is that you have a receiver wire from the speedo that is long enough to reach from the speedo to the receiver. If this is your first mid-motor car, you need to keep that in mind, because on the older style of cars, the speedo was always next to the receiver, but now it's quite a long way from the receiver, which is in front of the servo, to the speedo, which is at the back of the car. So always make sure that you have receiver wire that is long enough to reach from the speedo to the receiver. If not, you need to replace it or use some kind of extension, even though I don't recommend doing that. Okay, so that's all ready. To put this in the car, first of all, I'm going to show you how the cables are arranged. So you can choose to use different orientations of the speedo, but the orientation I've chosen here is the one where I use the least amount of wire for my application. So the speedo is going to be mounted here behind the motor. The power cables from the speedo to the motor are all very short, and they're kept on the side of the motor to keep the CG low. And then we have the battery cables sticking out from the side of the speedo. So the battery terminals on the battery are going to be towards the back. I'm just going to demonstrate this. The battery is going to sit like this, and these cables can reach the battery in the back. That's the best way of pulling the wires. And then the capacitor goes here behind the speedo, right on the chassis. So when we have this combo all wired up and ready to go in the car, we obviously have to install the electronics with double-sided tape, but we're gonna start with the receiver. So I'm gonna put the receiver in this spot here behind the servo. So for this I'm gonna use Hoodie double-sided tape. That works the best for this purpose. I always put the receiver next to the servo here. We can wire up the servo already. Plug that in. And then we can start to put double-sided tape on the speedo and the capacitor. So the trick that I'm using here is I'm pulling the ESC wire underneath the speedo. So I'm just putting two small strips of double-sided tape to give space for the wire in the middle. So we can hide the wire under the speedo. And that works out pretty good like that. But before installing this in the car, we're gonna need a pinion on the motor. So I suggest using the Hoodie lightweight pinion. It's a really nice and light pinion that works great and lasts long. So this needs to be installed quite far out on the motor shaft because of the position of the spur gear. So almost at the very end of the rotor shaft, you need to install the pinion. Okay. Getting ready to mount all of this here. Okay, put the wire in between the tape strips here. And then the motor. And this wire for the receiver needs to go above the motor. Because there's no space underneath the motor like it was on the T4. So the wire goes above the motor and not underneath. Okay, so now it's important to put this in place so that the power wires are not interfering with the top deck. that's point number 1. Okay, so the speedo is in place. The power cables are with good clearance from the top deck. And finally we can put the motor in place. And I'm gonna install the motor. Make sure that you get the gear mesh correctly. And then finally you can install this cable here. It's just long enough. Okay, and what about the motor fan? We have a 30mm fan here from Hoodie, which looks like this. And this comes with a plug already on the fan, so we can easily plug this into the receiver. But how do we fixate it on chassis? You can either use the universal fan mount, which mounts right here on the motor mount, or we can just fixate it with double-sided tape. But I'm gonna demonstrate how we can use this fan mount. So it mounts right here in the lower corner hole on the fan. I'm gonna use this long screw here. Like that, we mount the fan mount onto the fan, and then we have to put a screw here just where the spur is. Actually, we're gonna have to remove the spur for this particular step to quickly remove the spur gear, because it's very easy to remove on this car. we can have access to the little hole where we mount the optional fan mount with a round head screw. Comes out there, right in the spot where we want the fan. Okay, that's a perfect fit. And then we can just plug this into the receiver. And we'll put the spur gear back. So the electronics installation on the X4 takes a bit more time than on older platforms, but if you plan everything right and you make the cables the right length, then it's very rewarding once it's done and very efficient. So it's very important here that we have clearance for the cables to the top deck, both for the motor wires and the power cables, that they cannot interfere with the top deck. The wire needs to be long enough to reach the receiver from the speedo. And if you want to mount a fan, I recommend using either the optional fan mount or double-sided tape. And that's the electronics all in place. Weight balance is extremely important for the handling of the car, and on the X4 it's not an exception. So we're gonna cover some of the things that you should think about when you place the weights on the car, and how you can make the car as balanced as possible, not only between left and right, but also between front and rear. And we're also going to talk about the difference in handling when you change the weight bias between front and rear. So first of all, we need to see what kind of electronics we have in the car, because this varies, of course, depending on the racing class and the electronics used. If you use handout electronics, or you can choose to use your own electronics. So since I'm racing in the modified class, I'm using quite normal electronics on the left side of the car, and normal long type of battery on the right side of the car, but it's not a super heavy battery. This battery only weighs 245 grams, so it's fairly light, so we're not going to need that much weight to compensate for the weight of the battery, which you might need in the stock classes where you use very heavy batteries sometimes. And that may need a compensation in weight to be added on the left side to compensate for how heavy the battery is. But in this case it's not needed because it is quite light. But the first thing that I can recommend to install is the optional tungsten weight, which goes into the chassis slot on the right side. And it's really convenient to use because it's a very low point of the car where you can add weight, so it doesn't really affect the weight balance or affect the CG very much at all. Quickly gonna install this in the car. So what do I use to fixate this into the car? I use Hoodie thin double-sided tape. And it's important to use a thin tape for this weight, because if not, it will not fit into the slot and it will protrude above the chassis. So you want to use the thinnest possible tape that you can. In this case, the Hoodie tape. Just install this here. then we're gonna put this on the chassis here. See, it fits perfectly into the slot here, and it's perfectly flat thanks to the very thin tape. And that's step number one. I mostly recommend to run that weight there. Okay, so how can we know that the car is balanced between left and right? You can use these Hoodie balancing tools, these little pins. They're a bit simple, but they actually work really well for this purpose. And they can give you a quick answer if the car is out of balance or if it's well balanced. So you need to install these into the little holes on the chassis, which are specifically made for these pins. At each end of the chassis you have one hole to put these pins inside. Okay, now we can check the balance from left to right. So let's see if it can stay balanced. It stays fairly balanced. When it's balanced on the pins like this, it seems a little left heavy because it wants to tip over a bit to the left. So that means that we might need to add a little bit of weight to the right, towards the right side of the car. But keep in mind that we still haven't installed the battery mounting system yet, so that should mean that we have a bit of weight still to be added to the right side of the car. Okay, let's move on to see what we can do with adding more weights. We also have something new and really nice on the X4, which is these brass nickel coated weights, which they all attach straight to the motor mount in the center of the car. So the benefit of having these weights is that you can mount them on the motor mount directly with screws, no tape needed. And the benefit of having weight right in the center of the car is that it doesn't affect the weight balance of the car or the weight bias. It simply adds weight as close to the center of the car as possible. And since the car is pretty light and you normally need to add weight to make the minimum weight rule for races, it's a really convenient way to add weight in a really low and central spot. So I'm going to demonstrate how you can use these weights. So in this case, I'm just going to add weights to the front side of the motor mount, but you can use these brass nickel coated weights also at the back of the motor mount, so at both sides of the motor mount. But I'm just going to install two of them. They come with these little 2.5mm screws, which are specifically made for these. And these are really easy to install here. We just slide them into place. And they are fixated with one screw. So these option parts are really highly recommended, and they really fit the car in the best possible spot. We also have one little weight which we can mount here in front of the spur gear. And there they are, they're fitted onto the car. One weight in front of the spur and one at the back of the spur. Look how nice that looks, and we have added quite a bit of weight in a good spot. Okay, so let's talk about weight bias for a minute. It's a very sensitive thing for the handling of the car, how we put the weights in terms of bias. So do we want the car to be 50-50 balanced, the same amount of weight in the front as in the rear, or do we want it to be biased towards one direction? This depends on the handling of the car and what kind of handling we're trying to achieve. It's true that the X4, it really seems to work well with more weight towards the rear of the car compared to the T4. And it's much easier to drive in terms of handling as a platform. So you can get away with adding more weight to the rear of the car and still having the car really easy to drive. Because when you add weight to the rear of the car, you improve rotation. The car will have more cornering speed, but it will be more difficult to drive, typically. So more rear weight bias, such as 49-51 or even 48-52, will improve rotation a lot, but it will make the car more difficult to drive. So the best basic setting is usually 50-50, or if the grip is high enough and you need more rotation, move weight to the rear. For very high grip conditions and conditions where you're struggling with traction rolling or a very loose rear, you can consider to add more weight to the front, such as 51-49 or weight bias. And how do we check the weight bias? The best way to check it is by using these aftermarket scales, individual scales for all four corners. So you put the car on these scales and you can get a reading on your phone or on your separate station that connects the weights, and you can see the load on each tire. And this has to be done after the car has been tweaked, which we'll go through later, the chassis tweak. But the weight bias is a very important part of the setup, and is something that you should always take a look at and consider when you're making your setup. So if we want to add more weight to the rear of this car, then how can we do that? We have several options. For example, we have these Hoodie tungsten weights, which are super nice. I'm just going to demonstrate one of them. They are made in tungsten, so that means that they're very dense, very small and low weights, but with quite a lot of weight. So the use of the tungsten material has many benefits. I'm going to install one of these weights at the back of the car. I'm just going to install this right in the center line of the car here, below the belt, because we're not using the T-brace in this car. And something else that I can recommend is the Hoodie precision balancing weights, which are screwed onto the car. These are 10-gram weights. They can be screwed onto the chassis. We also offer these in the new tungsten version, which is also really nice. So these can just be screwed onto the car here in the back. You don't have to use tape to fixate these. For example, you can install one here at the back of the chassis. And I think that's enough for a start, but I'm gonna install one more of these weights here in the back. We're going for a bit of a rearward weight balance on this car because it's It's a modified car that I'm building for a bit higher grip tracks. And moving these weights around will have a significant impact on the weight bias. So just moving 5 grams from the rear of the car to the front can have a massive impact, can make 1% difference in weight bias, which doesn't sound much, but it's really gonna have a big impact on the handling. So I hope that I've given you some useful pointers in terms of weight balance, and that you can use this information to tune your car accordingly. So we're gonna put together the battery mounting system for the X4, which is the same system used on the T4. And it's a fully adjustable battery mounting system, which doesn't need any tape to mount the battery. So it's completely tape-free. And it's very easy to use, and I'm gonna put it together now. Set screws goes into the hole here, which hold these little pins that are adjustable. Repeat the process for the front part. And then we use these super long screws to go into these adjustable pieces here. There it is. If you're running a shorty pack, very low CG shorty pack, you'll need to mount these in the opposite direction, so upside down. But in this case, we're gonna mount them in the regular direction. Okay, these are done. And then we have these long carbon holders for the battery, but they're gonna have to be raised up with these carbon shims, which are included in the kit, which is a new feature on the X4. The idea to raise these up is to have better security for the battery, so that it doesn't pop out of the holders in a crash. Basically to keep it in place. So always put the shim in there before you put the little hook that holds the battery in place. All in place there. And finally, these little pieces that you can turn, they have to be inserted here with the long screws. And obviously these can be adjusted depending on the height of your battery, the type of your battery. Okay. Battery mount is in place, so we're gonna have to adjust the height of these holders as well to accommodate for the height of this battery. I'm gonna turn these until they should not touch the battery, but they should be very close. So we have a little bit of upwards play, a little bit of play front to back, and finally we're gonna adjust the play from side to side. As you can see, it's very easy to adjust the play in each direction with the adjustability of these battery mounts, which are included in the kit. Okay, so now we have a decent amount of play in all directions. Nothing is binding up, so I'm pretty happy with that. And having this play will prevent the battery mounting from affecting the handling of the car. And I think that's it. That concludes the battery mounting system. So the body upstops on the X4 is once again included as standard, just like on the T421, but they're much simpler and easier to use on the X4 compared to the T421, and I'm going to show you how. So I'm going to demonstrate this on my ready-built car here. As you can see here in the front upper arm, there's a screw hole here, which I explained about in the build of the upper arm. You can install a long screw into the screw hole, and this long screw acts as a body upstop. You can adjust the length of these to have different points of the body upstop to start working. So I usually just check this distance here. It's 10.5 in this case, between the upper arm and the top of the screw. You also have the option to use a ball cup with a set screw, which you can thread into this hole. And when you use the ball cup and a set screw, you can obviously adjust it with your hands, so it's a bit quicker to adjust than the screw, but it's just another option for you to try. When you run these ball cups, make sure that they're pointing towards the front of the car so that they're not in a horizontal position, because then they can get close to the wheel and they can touch the wheel during cornering. So that's the other option you have. So what are then the benefits of using the body upstops? I'm gonna demonstrate this clearly. So the point of the body upstop is that when you go into a corner, suspension is compressing, and the body shell will get close to or will touch the ground. But if you use the body upstops, I'm gonna loosen these to exaggerate the effect. If you put these very high, they are gonna push the body shell up before the body shell gets a chance to hit the ground, even on full suspension compression. So in this case, you can see here that the very last movement of the suspension, the body shell is not moving, so it's never touching the ground, it stays off the ground. And this allows you to run the front of the body shell lower without it touching the ground. And we all know that a lower front body shell gives you more front downforce, which equals to more front grip. And that can also equal to faster lap times. So this is very much recommended for open outdoor tracks, and especially on high-speed tracks. And you need to keep in mind that when you're using this function, make sure that the holes in the body shell in the front are big enough so that it can move completely freely up and down on the posts. Because if it's binding on the posts, it's going to defeat the purpose of the body upstop. So you can see here, the posts are moving down, but the body shell stays. And that's the function of the body upstop, and it has several benefits for the handling.